From Temple University, this is Profiles in Literature, featuring interviews with authors and illustrators prominent in American literature for children. The moderator for this series is Dr. Jaqueline Shachter, Professor of Children's Literature with Temple University.
Hello, I'm Jaqueline Shachter, a Professor of Children's Literature at Temple University. Welcome to Profiles in Literature. Today we have the rare privilege of presenting a two-time Newbery Medal winner, Elizabeth George Speare. While we get a close-up view of her medals, perhaps you can tell us in what year you won each and for what book.
The Witch of Blackbird Pond won the Newbery in 1959 and the Bronze Bow in 1962.
This is a very unusual occurrence. To date, there have only been two people who have won the Newbery Medal twice, Elizabeth Speare and Joseph Crumgold. Joining us on this special occasion are Mrs. Carolyn Field, Coordinator of Work with Children for the Free Library of Philadelphia, my collaborator on the Profiles in Literature series, and Dr. Paul Schallers, Professor of Children's Literature in Temple University's English Department. Also in the studio audience, we have Paul Doyon, 12 years old, who drew that excellent drawing he's showing from the Bronze Bow. Tell us the scene you're showing.
Right here, this is a scene about Daniel saving his friend Joe.
Very good.
Daniel, well, here are the Romans, and Daniel is right here.
It's excellent, Paul. Really very fine.
Thank you.
In The Bronze Bow, historical fiction set in biblical times, Elizabeth Speare shows the struggle of the Israelites against the occupying army of mighty Rome. In the beginning of the book, the protagonist, Daniel Bar-Jarman, is a member of an impoverished militant guerrilla group. In this episode, he is in a secret passageway in a Pharisee home, recuperating from wounds of the ribs inflicted by a Roman soldier. 16-year-old twins, Joel Bar-Hezron, a student, and Thasia, his sister, are the children of the Pharisee who have hidden Daniel in the passageway. And now they listen with interest as he explains why he feels so bitter toward all Romans.
All I know is that I hate the Romans. I want their blood. It is all I live for. It is all I've lived for since...
Since what, Daniel?
They killed my father and mother.
Tell us, Daniel.
It is not a good story for a girl to hear.
Is it about your mother?
About them both?
If it's about my own people, about another woman like myself, then I can hear it.
It was when I was 8 years old. I was in the synagogue school then. My father was overseer of the vineyards. It was a good job. I don't remember ever being hungry or afraid. He used to tell us stories after the evening meal. He knew them all by heart. My sister was only 5. She had yellow hair and blue eyes like our mother. That's because our mother's mother was a Greek slave who married her Jewish master. But my mother never knew any foreign ways. She believed in the God of the Jews. She taught us verses from the scripture and made us say them after her. I think we were like all the other families. Perhaps it is still like that in the houses in the village.
It's like that in our house, too.
My father had a brother, younger than he was, and they were very close. When I was very young, my uncle used to live in our house with us, but then he married and went to live in a house of his own not far away. I can remember the wedding. They let me walk in the procession, and I was so excited that I dropped my torch and burned a hole in my new coat. My uncle was so proud of his wife. When they had their first baby, a boy, you would think no one ever had had a son before. He did a very foolish thing. It was almost time for taxes, and he took a part of the money that he had saved to buy his wife a present. a shawl with gold thread to wear to the naming. He had planned to find extra work and make up the money. But that year the Romans were building a new section of road, and the collector came early. Well, my uncle should have come to my father, but he was ashamed because, of course, none of us ever had money to spare. So he tried to argue that it was not yet time. He was a very excitable man, and the collector was angry and reported him. The soldiers came and took him to the guardhouse. As soon as my father heard, he went to all his friends and tried to collect enough money for the tax. But my uncle had lost his head and tried to fight his way out, and they would not let him go. They said he would have to go to the quarry to pay off his debts. But we all knew that they would not let him go, or that my uncle would try to fight and get killed. His wife was almost out of her mind. She came to my father and put her arms around his knees and began to scream at him. So my father made a plan. He was a peaceful man, but he armed himself. He and 4 others hid in a cornfield and waited till the Romans started for the city with my uncle, and then they attacked. Of course, they were all captured. One soldier was cut with a sickle, and he died that night. Well, they wanted to make an example for the village. They crucified all 6 of them, even my uncle, who had done nothing because he had his hands tied behind him. My mother stood out at the crosses all day and all night for 2 days. It was foggy and cold at night, and when she finally came back, she did nothing but cough and cry. She only lived a few weeks.
Were you there too?
Yes, I was there. After my father died, I made a vow. Perhaps I would say a boy 8 years old couldn't make a vow, a real one that was binding. But I did. I vowed that I would pay them back with my whole life. That I would hate them and fight them and kill them. That's all I lived for.
As you know, Daniel maintains that vow throughout the book until the very end. What were you thinking as you saw that?
I'd forgotten that I ever had anything to do with it. I was just caught up in it. I think he did a beautiful piece of narrating there.
Yes, he did.
I was thrilled with it.
Who did those?
Those are people from the drama and the radio, television, film department here at
Temple? Oh,
Yes.
they're great.
They really are.
Mrs. Elaine Lee is from Glassboro State College in New Jersey.
Well, using this book, The Witch of Blackbird Pond, which seems to be the most popular with young people, I'd like to ask you about, on the one hand, developing a book that is historically authentic and maintaining that in your book, and at the same time maintaining your end result, or maintaining what you're driving for in developing a strong character. What are some of the joys and pitfalls of doing those two things concomitantly?
I think the main pitfall that I've encountered in my own work and in work of friends who've asked me to read novels that they've written is that sometimes you get fascinated with a bit of history and you pull it in, although it's extraneous and really does not develop the plot. And I've been quite rigid with myself about that unless I found a double reason for every bit of history, I didn't include it. Although I had, of course, Anna Stuff said once, historical writing is like an iceberg because most of the research doesn't show it all, but it's there. And you only draw on the part that does tend to develop either the plot or the character. And unless it could serve that double purpose, I tried not to use it.
Who's the 3 themes of your book?
Well, the theme of Kit's being a misfit and gradually coming to understand the Puritans. And I was fascinated by the Quaker history, which I brought in Hannah Tupper. And then, of course, the recurring background of the preparation for the Revolution. Although this was nearly 100 years before, they were already thinking about oppression.
Obviously they were, yes. That book happens to be a favorite of my students, too. Perhaps because witch hunts aren't limited to the 17th century.
Well, witches are very popular nowadays anyway.
But Jackie, it's also a favorite of all girls and boys because it's the most sold Newbery Award winner. The Witch of Blackbird Pond.
Is
Right.
that true? I didn't really realize
Sells
that.
more copies than any other Newbery Award winner.
Well, you can see that your fiction lends itself very well to being dramatized. I wonder if you've ever been approached for adaptation of your books into motion picture or television film.
Well, I have my fingers crossed right now because I have an option out on The Witch.
Oh, do you?
And we'll just see whether they take it up or not.
Carolyn Field was very, very important in the selection of The Witch of Blackbird Pond as the Newbery winner. Tell us about that, Carolyn.
Well, it is sort of exciting because that year I was chairman of the Newbery Caldecott Committee. And we normally have one male vote. And then we meet together at midwinter to discuss the books. And of course, part of the choosing of the books is the discussion. That's why it's great to serve on a Newbery Caldecott Committee. But this year, both the Newbery and the Caldecott were selected on the first ballot. It gave us no reason to get together. But we got together anyway and decided that from now on, the first ballot would be taken at midwinter after discussion. And then I had the privilege, of course, of presenting the medal to Mrs. Speare in Washington, D.C., where the dinner was held that year. So I feel as if the Witch of Blackbird Pond belongs to me, too.
Do you have a question you want to ask Mrs. Speare?
Well, basically, I would like to ask you about your early writing. Did you start to write as a child? Were you interested in writing?
Oh, yes.
How did you get going in it?
And, I took a long time getting really underway. But I have a little brown notebook at home that was my first novel that I started when I was, I think, 8 years old. And it's illustrated by pictures cut out of magazines and pasted into the book. And it, I think, is modeled on the Bobbsey twins because I started out a series of Dorothy Swain in the country and Dorothy Swain at boarding school. I didn't get very far.
Well, now, although you write fiction primarily, it's fiction based on research.
Yes.
So where did you get interested in this? You didn't do that for the Bobbsey twins or your...
No, I really wasn't interested in history, as I remember it, all through my school years. But I think what started me on the first book was a story in that wonderful Rivers of America series on the Connecticut River.
The Calico Captive?
About the captivity of Susanna Johnson, which was one of the famous Indian captivities in Massachusetts. And I thought it would make a wonderful story for a girl's book, such as I used to enjoy reading. And I looked up the original little volume of Susanna's narrative, and I found that while she was a marvelous character, I was fascinated by the younger sister who was captured with her.
Yes, you did an excellent job of carrying out the Miriam Willard theme in the book. I thought perhaps Paul would like to get into this issue of writing, since that's his...
Right, I was very interested in what did prompt you to write the various books, whether it was character or history to begin with. Is that true of all of them, with a historical account or...
No, I'm sure it's people that get me started, and it's people that have been my interest in history. I've discovered that suddenly history is a different study for me when I can relate it to people in their everyday lives.
Personalized history.
And how the events of history helped or hurt individual families.
Well, I realized in reading The Witch for the second time that I had looked at character primarily the first time, and that the second time I had looked much more at the background of that character. And I noticed how much you do bring in history and daily events, candle making, that sort of thing.
But I do try to make it subordinate to the people.
Exactly.
I try not to bring any historical fact in unless it really relates to a person and has something to do with the advancement of the character.
So, for example, the political conflict in The Witch is all reflective of Matthew and William, and it's working with the characters rather than coming out for itself.
It was for me.
Where did you get the idea for The Witch, though? This girl from Barbados.
There's a wonderful series of books on colonial America written by Alice Morse Earle, which are still around, and they're a gold mine for anyone who wants to write in that period. And in home life of colonial days, I found a little story, or maybe it was child life, a little story of a girl 16, a girl 10 years old who came from Barbados to study, which was common in those days. And she lived with her grandmother in Boston, and she was very hoity-toity. And she brought with her a number of trunks and a personal maid. And she wrote back that her grandmother wouldn't let her have wine and beer with her meals. And she was very unhappy. Her grandmother wouldn't buy her a new muff. And it suddenly occurred to me that I would make this girl a little older and send her not to Boston, which was, of course, the center of civilization in America, but to a really Puritan outpost, such as I was living in at the time, Wethersfield, Connecticut.
Well, you said you were not a great history buff in the early days, but I noticed that you did a book for Random House in one of their large landmark series called Life in Colonial America. Now, this is definite history, research. Did you enjoy doing it?
It's people still, though.
Were you asked to do this, or did you decide to? I was asked to do that,
yes.
Commissioned writing. You make excellent use of diaries, not only in the preparation of Calico Captive, but also the Bird Diary appears here in Life in Colonial.
I use many diaries in my research.
I thought perhaps you could tell us how you go about organizing the writing task from the research stage to the finished draft.
Well, of course, the research comes first, and that's the fascinating part, and that's the fun part. And I can spend indefinite hours poking around in libraries and finding all of these various pieces that are going to perhaps fit together and perhaps be abandoned. But that can take an indefinite length of time. With the Bronze Bow, for example, it took a great deal of time because I really knew nothing about ancient Palestine, nothing whatsoever. And I read, Josephus histories and all sorts of travel books. I had never been to the Holy Land. And that can consume many months, maybe more than a year. But eventually the time comes when you have to settle down and start writing, sooner or later. And that is a task. I write them usually 3 times through. The first time is the hardest. After that, it's pure fun to rewrite.
Do you write with the typewriter, directly at the typewriter?
I write at the typewriter.
Do you outline previous to writing?
Yes, I do. I have big holes in the outline, places that I'm not sure what will fit in. But I have to know where I'm going. I have a strong feeling that, for me at least, it would be impossible to write anything unless I knew where I was going to come out in the end.
So you do have your predetermined ending.
I know this is contrary to many modern writings, but I have to know where I'm going. Sometimes I'm not sure how I'm going to get there.
So you don't like the idea of writing serialized chapters that go out in a magazine month by month?
Well, of course, that would paralyze me if I had a deadline like that.
I'm also interested in what prompted you to the biblical story, the Bronze Bow, when all your other books, both the 3 novels and the nonfiction work, are all set in the East, colonial America.
I think that was probably a labor of love. I was teaching Sunday school, and it all seemed so amorphous and meaningless to my students, and really to me too. The whole period was just a big blank in their minds. It could have been yesterday, it could have been prehistoric times. They just had no idea what it was all about. And the characters and personalities from the Bible were just too vague. There was at that time a series, The Greatest Story Ever Told, which some of you might remember, in which Jesus sometimes spoke, and when they did, they used a special sound box for his voice, and it was a hollow, pretentious, solemn voice that was inhuman. And all this seemed repulsive to me, and I wanted to make Jesus a human being and the people who followed him human beings, and I started out with that purpose, definitely.
Have you had some questions about the Bronze Bow and about the characters and the theme?
Yes, I have. I've had some challenges on the Jewish history, which I really worked very, very hard on. And I was caught up by the marvelous background, the pride that any Jewish person must have in such a history, so that I can't quite understand why it's been challenged.
As an anti-Semitic.
But some people have found that.
But I would question it, if I were going to question it, on your making a hero of someone who is an absolute fanatic and feels that the end is worth the means.
Well, strangely enough, I did that before all the youth protests.
Did you?
This was, when such people were heroes. This was unheard of at that time.
Other questioners are from a class of mine in children's literature. I'm proud to introduce Patty Costello.
Mrs. Speare, I think I've gained insight into some of my questions from your books because they did center around characters. And you did mention how now your renewed interest in history came from characterization, how people live their daily lives. So that helps me a little, but I'm concerned about the character Leah in The Bronze Bow. She was so sickly, and then she did develop somewhat. Why did you choose something like this, you know, some character like this, to go alongside a brother who was so domineering and so belligerent and revolting, I guess?
I think you can't tell always why you did things. They just happen. This is quite true. It sounds affected when anyone says it, but it is true that these things suddenly happen. As I look back on it, I think probably I needed Leah for Daniel's development, because it was his love for her that changed him in a large respect. But I don't suppose I actually thought, now I need someone. Leah was just there, that's all.
She was a very original character, too. Made interesting reading. Debbie Smith?
Mrs. Speare, your characters all seem to have a lot of control over their lives for young people. You know, today kids don't really, you know, they're shuffled here and shuffled there, and they're sort of controlled a little bit more than your characters seem to. Is this something that you see lacking, maybe? Or do you think that kids today can relate to characters that really have control over their lives?
Well, I hadn't thought about it being related to today, except that I understand The Witch is one of the few books that is acceptable because I have an independent heroine. I think I chose an easy way out in having practically orphans, because, of course, that eliminates much of the control. I don't think I did it consciously, but it does leave your character a great deal more freedom. And, of course, they were in challenging times, too, when people really had to rise to circumstances.
That's true, and much more maturity was required of them. For example, a 16-year-old then seems much more mature than a 16-year-old today by many standards.
In some ways.
Eileen Spector.
Mrs. Speare, I was interested in the female character in your books. It seems like it was the female who was always the strong character. She controlled most of everything that went on in all your books. And I was interested in why, if that was a reflection of you yourself, your childhood, or just your feelings on women.
I probably was writing with a girl audience in mind because I had been such a great reader myself. But when I came to The Bronze Bow, I started with a girl. I started with the sister, Thacia. And I came to a complete halt at the end of the first chapter and could go nowhere because I realized that I was in a period in which girls were really completely subservient, and that my heroine was not going to get out and see any of the action at all. It would all have to be off stage, so I switched in that case.
Or you had to disguise her as a boy when she
Yes,
did get
I
out
did
into the
have
action. Ray Muller.
Mrs. Speare, I'd like to ask you what part of The Bronze Bow, what part of the book you like doing best, because for a book with no illustrations in it, I really gotten absorbed in the book, and it seemed like when you portrayed the life of Christ, you know, I could almost imagine myself being right there, you know, hearing his words and, you know, imagining the countryside, what it was like, or being next to the water. It just seems like you made it come so alive, and I was wondering what part of the book, Bronze Bow, you enjoyed doing the most, or the whole book.
I enjoyed the book, but I found difficult spots where it was weeks where before I could see my way over the chasm. I wasn't always completely satisfied with the way I did find my way over. I was caught up in that period myself. I did a great deal of reading before I could reach that point.
Do you prefer not to have your books illustrated?
I didn't think of it. They just don't provide illustrations for these books.
They aren't necessary. They really aren't.
No, they can be very disappointing. The jacket of The Bronze Bow was done twice, because the first time they provided some simply horrible characters for it, so that you can be very disappointed with illustrations.
It's hardly a great improvement as it is at present.
True.
Rich Leonard.
You bear with me another question on character.
The character of Matthew Wood is probably my second favorite in all of literature, after Shakespeare's Lear. And I'd just like to know, I loved him, and I hated every time he went out of the picture. But that's what I wanted to ask. Do you think he just symbolizes all Puritanism, or?
No, he symbolized the men I had known, because I have known old New England men like that, and I've had them in my own life. I've had the harshness, because in our neighborhood in New England, I knew a man whose daughter had cried her eyes out because she'd been engaged to a young man in the country town where they lived, and on Halloween night he took a wagon from one of the selectmen's yards and dragged it down the road and put it in someone else's yard, and she was forced to break her engagement. That was one side of Matthew Wood, but then there was the other side, which comes through in an emergency, that's strong and can be relied on, and that is fair and just, and I just know men like that.
Could you also comment on the character of Samson in The Bronze Bow?
Well, Samson was a sort of necessity, I think, but somehow he was there like Leah. First I was going to have it a slave girl, but he turned into the character he did.
Very, very much, Mrs. Speare. We know that you are a perfectionist in your writing style. It comes as no surprise to learn that you were a former high school English teacher. We very much appreciate your coming from Fairfield, Connecticut to give us this chance to know you.
I'm delighted to be here.